November 1943. Three German soldiers stood in the rain outside a British prison camp, shivering in their dirty uniforms. They had no idea that in a few weeks they would start building something that would still be standing 80 years later. They had never heard of Alberta, Canada. They didn't even know where Canada was, but they were about to go there, and they were about to build a ski hill that would change everything they believed about their enemies. The oldest soldier was Captain Friedrich Weber. He was 34 years old, and before the war, he taught people how to ski in the mountains of Bavaria. Those mountains were beautiful, with snow-covered peaks that touched the clouds. Friedrich had skied down those slopes his whole life. He knew how to build ski lifts and warming huts. He knew which trees made the best support beams and how steep a hill should be for beginners. But right now, standing in the cold British rain, he thought he would never see mountains again. He thought he was going to die. Friedrich had fought in Poland, then France, then Italy. He was captured at a place called Monte Cassino after 6 weeks of hiding in bombed-out buildings while shells exploded all around him. When the British soldiers found him, he raised his hands and waited to be shot. That's what his officers told him would happen. The British and Canadians are monsters, they said. They will torture you for information, then kill you. Friedrich had written a final letter to his wife and 2 sons, but he never sent it. He kept it folded in his pocket next to his heart. The second soldier was much younger. Private Hans Becker was only 21 years old, and he came from a farm in northern Germany, where the land was flat and cold. Hans had never seen a mountain in his life. He got seasick on boats and hated fighting. When his unit surrendered in Tunisia back in May, Hans felt relieved. He was tired of being shot at. He was tired of being hungry. But he was also terrified. The Nazi propaganda films showed Canadian soldiers as cruel men who enjoyed killing prisoners. Hans heard stories that Canadians would shoot you rather than waste food feeding you. He believed those stories. Everyone believed them. The third soldier was Klaus Zimmermann, 28 years old, from a factory town called Essen. Klaus had been a leader in the Hitler Youth before the war. He wore a small Hitler Youth pin hidden under his uniform collar. He still believed everything the Nazi Party taught him. He believed Germany was fighting to save the world from evil. He believed the British and Canadians were controlled by Jewish conspiracies. He believed that if he was captured, he would be tortured because democratic nations were weak and cruel. Klaus was angry that his unit had surrendered in Sicily. He called the British Guards race traitors under his breath. He refused to accept that Germany might be losing the war. Now all 3 men stood together with 844 other German prisoners, waiting to board a transport ship. A British officer announced their destination: Canada. Most of the prisoners looked confused. Hans whispered to the man next to him, "Where is that? Is it even a real country?" The other prisoner shrugged. Friedrich knew Canada was somewhere across the Atlantic Ocean. But that was all he knew. Klaus assumed it was another name for Siberia, where he'd heard Russian camps killed prisoners by the thousands. The German soldiers had been taught many things about their enemies. They learned that Canadians were just puppets of the British Empire, ruthless colonial enforcers who showed no mercy. They learned that if you were captured, your family back home would be told you died in battle. They learned that prison camps in Allied countries were worse than anything in Germany, with starvation rations and brutal forced labor. Every single thing they learned was about to be proven wrong. On November 15th, the guards loaded all 847 prisoners onto a huge ship called the HMS Empress of Scotland. Friedrich counted the men as they walked up the ramp. He noticed the British guards looked bored, not cruel. They smoked cigarettes and talked about football. One guard helped an older prisoner who stumbled on the wet deck. Friedrich thought this was strange. In German camps, guards beat prisoners who stumbled. The ship's cargo hold was dark and smelled like oil and salt water. Hans felt his stomach turn before the ship even left the dock. He knew he was going to be sick for days. Klaus found a corner away from the others and sat with his arms crossed, glaring at anyone who came near. Friedrich found a spot near a small porthole where he could see a tiny circle of gray sky. He took out his letter home and read it one more time. Dear Helena and boys, if you receive this, it means I did not survive. Please know I thought of you every day. Please tell the boys their father tried to be brave. Please forgive me for not coming home. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket. Through the porthole, he could see Liverpool's bombed buildings in gray clouds. The rain kept falling. Somewhere across the ocean was a place called Canada, and these three men, the ski instructor, the farm boy, and the true believer, were about to discover that everything they knew was a lie. They would build something together that would last longer than the war, longer than the Reich, longer than their own lives. But on this cold November day, surrounded by 844 other prisoners in a dark cargo hold, they knew none of that yet. They only knew they were afraid and far from home and heading into the unknown. The ship left Liverpool on a gray morning, and Hans ran to the corner of the cargo hold to vomit before they even reached open water. He had been sick on every boat he'd ever been on, and this one was going to be the worst. 9 days across the Atlantic Ocean, 9 days of rolling waves and spinning rooms, and the smell of diesel fuel mixed with the smell of 847 unwashed men. He wanted to die. But then something strange happened. A British guard came down into the hold carrying blankets. Real blankets, thick and gray, made of wool. He handed one to each prisoner. Hans took his and stared at it. He had expected to sleep on bare metal floors. He had expected to freeze. The guard saw him looking confused and said, "You'll need it. Gets cold at night, on the water." Then the guard walked away. Friedrich found a bunk, an actual bunk with a thin mattress. There were rows and rows of them, stacked too high along the walls of the hold. He touched the mattress. It was stuffed with straw, nothing fancy, but it was softer than the ground in Italy where he'd slept for weeks. This made no sense. Why give blankets and beds to prisoners? Why waste resources on men you were supposed to hate? 2 hours later, guards brought down metal trays of food. Hot food. Friedrich smelled it before he saw it. Potatoes and some kind of meat stew and bread. Real bread, not the sawdust mixed with flour they'd been eating at the front. Each man got a full tray with a tin cup of water. Friedrich ate slowly, counting each bite. He estimated about 650 grams of food on his tray. That was more than he'd eaten in a single day for months. Hans managed to eat half his portion before his stomach rebelled, and he ran to vomit again. Klaus refused to touch his food. "It's poison," he muttered. "They're trying to weaken us." But the food kept coming. Twice a day, every day, the guards brought down hot meals. Breakfast was porridge with dried fruit and sometimes bacon. Dinner was always soup or stew with bread. Friedrich kept counting. By the third day, he calculated they were each getting about 2,400 calories per day. That was more food than German civilians were getting back home. That was almost as much as soldiers at the front received. Why would the British feed prisoners this well if they were running out of food themselves? It didn't match what the propaganda said. The propaganda said Britain was starving, desperate, on the verge of collapse. On the fourth day, Red Cross workers came aboard and handed out parcels. Each parcel contained cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and writing paper. Hans stared at the chocolate bar in his hands like it was made of gold. He hadn't seen real chocolate in 2 years. Klaus threw his parcel in the corner. I won't accept charity from our enemies, he said. But Friedrich noticed that late at night Klaus retrieved the parcel and ate the chocolate in the darkness when he thought no one was watching. The British guards didn't act like prison guards at all. They played cards during their breaks and invited some of the German prisoners to join them. One guard named Corporal Murphy gave Hans medicine for his seasickness, little white pills that actually helped. My brother gets sick on boats too, Murphy said in broken German. These will settle your stomach. Hans swallowed the pills and felt better within an hour. He couldn't understand why an enemy soldier would help him feel better. Then came the night that changed everything. It was the 6th night at sea, and suddenly alarms started blaring. The ship's engines stopped. Everyone in the hold went silent. Friedrich heard running footsteps on the deck above. Someone shouted, "U-boat! Possible U-boat contact!" The prisoners looked at each other with wide eyes. A German submarine was out there in the dark water, hunting Allied ships. Their own navy might torpedo them without knowing German prisoners were aboard. Friedrich expected the guards to lock the cargo hold and leave them to drown if the ship was hit. That's what would happen in a German camp. Prisoners were expendable. But instead, British sailors came running down the stairs with keys. They unlocked every door and emergency hatch. One sailor shouted, "If we get hit, you'll have a chance to reach the lifeboats. Stay calm." Then the sailors ran back up to their battle stations, leaving the prisoners free to move. Klaus stood frozen in the center of the room. "They unlocked us," he whispered. "Why would they unlock us?" Friedrich had no answer. In that moment, waiting in the darkness while their own U-boats hunted above, something cracked in his understanding of the world. The British could have left them locked below to die. It would have been easier, safer, but they didn't. They gave the prisoners a chance to live. The U-boat scare passed. No torpedoes came. The ship's engines roared back to life, and they kept sailing west. But Friedrich couldn't stop thinking about those unlocked doors. Klaus sat in his corner and didn't speak for the rest of the voyage. Hans asked Friedrich quietly, "If we're such terrible enemies, why did they keep us alive?" Friedrich shook his head. He didn't know. But he was starting to suspect that everything they'd been told was wrong. On November 24th, 9 days after leaving Liverpool, the ship docked at Halifax, Canada. The temperature was -5 degrees Celsius, cold enough that their breath made clouds in the air. As they walked down the ramp onto Canadian soil, Friedrich saw the port city stretching before them, intact buildings, working cranes, ships being loaded with supplies, warehouses full of goods. Not a single bomb crater, not one ruined building. The lights were on everywhere, bright and wasteful, as if electricity cost nothing. Germany's cities were dark at night to hide from bombers. Britain's cities were half destroyed. But here in Canada, the lights blazed like it was peacetime. They loaded the prisoners onto trains, real passenger trains with seats and windows and wood-burning stoves in each car. At every station stop across the country, Canadian railway workers handed them bread and hot soup through the windows. Friedrich pressed his face to the glass and watched Canada roll past. Endless forests, enormous farms with barns bigger than German houses, small towns with churches and schools and people walking freely. No soldiers, no checkpoints, no fear. Hans stared at the Ontario farms and said, "Those barns are bigger than my family's entire house." Klaus finally broke his silence when they passed through Winnipeg. He looked at the cars on the streets, the full store windows, the well-dressed civilians, and said quietly, "Where are the bombs? Where's the destruction? They told us the Allies were losing." On December 1st, 1943, the train stopped at Lethbridge, Alberta. The temperature was -18 degrees. Snow covered everything. But to the west, Friedrich could see mountains rising against the sky, and for the first time since his capture, He felt something that wasn't fear. He felt hope. Camp 133 sat on the flat prairie just outside Lethbridge, Alberta. It covered 170 acres of land, surrounded by double rows of barbed wire fence with 8 tall watchtowers at the corners. But when Friedrich stepped off the train and looked at those towers, he noticed something odd. The guards up there were drinking coffee and talking to each other. They weren't even watching the prisoners very closely. They looked relaxed, almost bored. The camp had 34 long wooden barracks painted dark green. They looked new and solid, built to keep out the bitter Alberta winter. Canadian soldiers lined the prisoners up in rows and walked them through the main gate. Friedrich expected rough treatment, shouting, maybe beatings to establish who was in charge. Instead, a guard said politely, "Follow me to processing, please. Single file." "Please." The guard had said please to prisoners. Processing took 2 hours. They photographed each man's face from the front and side. They wrote down names, ranks, ages, and where each man was captured. Then a doctor examined everyone, one by one, checking eyes and ears and listening to heartbeats through a stethoscope. The doctor looked at Hans and said, "You're underweight. We'll fix that." He gave Hans a bottle of vitamins and told him to take one every morning. Friedrich watched this and thought about the German army. In the Wehrmacht, only officers got personal attention from doctors. Regular soldiers had to be dying before anyone cared. After processing, they issued each prisoner a clean uniform. Not the old dirty clothes they'd been wearing for months, but fresh wool uniforms in good condition with warm socks and real boots that fit properly. Hans held his new socks and almost cried. His old socks had holes so big he could fit his thumb through them. These new ones were thick and clean and smelled like soap. Then the guards took them to their assigned barracks. Friedrich walked into Barrack 17 and stopped in the doorway. The building had a coal stove in the center, already burning and making the room warm. Along both walls were rows of bunk beds, each with a real mattress and 2 wool blankets folded neatly at the foot. Every man got his own bunk. Friedrich had expected to sleep on the floor with 50 other men packed together like animals. But here he had his own space, his own mattress, his own blankets. The guard pointed to a building across the yard. "That's the wash house. Hot water available from 6 in the morning until 9 at night. Flush toilets, shower rooms, everything you need." Friedrich stared. Hot running water, flush toilets, shower rooms. His family's house in Bavaria didn't have indoor plumbing. They had an outhouse in the yard and a well with a hand pump. But here, in a prison camp, in the middle of nowhere, they had hot showers. Hans found a bunk near the stove and sat down slowly, testing the mattress. It compressed under his weight, soft and real. He lay back and closed his eyes. For the first time in 2 years, he felt warm and safe. This couldn't be real. This had to be a trick. At 6 o'clock that evening, guards called them to the mess hall for dinner. The mess hall was enormous, big enough to seat 200 men at long wooden tables. The room smelled like meat and gravy and fresh bread. Friedrich's mouth watered immediately. They lined up with metal trays and plates, and cooks behind a counter served each man. Friedrich watched his plate fill up. Beef stew with chunks of real meat and carrots and onions. Boiled potatoes with butter melting on top. 2 thick slices of white bread, and then, impossibly, a piece of apple pie with a golden crust. Friedrich found a scale in the corner of the mess hall and weighed his tray. 680 grams of food. He did the math in his head, roughly 3,200 calories. That was more than German soldiers at the front were getting. That was almost double what German civilians received on their ration cards. He sat down at a table and ate slowly, savoring every bite. The beef was tender and rich. The potatoes were creamy. The pie was sweet and tasted like cinnamon. Hans sat across from him and started eating. Then Hans stopped. His hands shook. His eyes filled with tears. He put his face in his hands and sobbed quietly. Friedrich understood. Hans hadn't seen this much food on one plate since before the war. None of them had. Klaus sat at the end of the table with his arms crossed. His full plate sat in front of him, untouched. "I won't eat it," he said. "They're trying to make us soft. They're trying to make us forget who we are. This is disgraceful." But Friedrich saw Klaus looking at the food. He saw the hunger in Klaus's eyes. After dinner, a Canadian officer came to their barracks. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a Scottish accent. He introduced himself as Captain Morrison, the camp commandant. He spoke slowly in English, while a translator repeated his words in German. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention," Morrison said. "You will be treated fairly. You will receive 3 meals per day, medical care, the right to send and receive mail, and payment for any work you do. 25 cents per day. You will not be tortured or mistreated. Is that clear?" Friedrich raised his hand. Morrison nodded at him. "When do the interrogations begin?" Friedrich asked. Morrison looked confused. "You were already interrogated in Britain. We have your information. We're not interrogators here. We're just keeping you safe until the war ends." The translator repeated this in German. The prisoners looked at each other in confusion. No interrogations, no beatings, no attempts to extract information. Klaus stood up. "This is obviously a trap," he announced. "They want us to trust them, then they'll strike." Morrison shrugged. "Believe what you want. But those are the rules here. You can write letters home starting tomorrow. 5 letters per month, all censored for security. Any questions?" No one spoke. Morrison left. The barracks went quiet, except for the crackling of the coal stove. Friedrich pulled out his notebook and wrote, December 3rd, 1943. Either everything we were told was a lie, or this is the most elaborate deception in history. But why? There are 12,500 of us here. I counted the guards, maybe 500 of them. The expense of feeding us like this would bankrupt a nation on the verge of defeat. Nothing makes sense, but I am warm, I am fed, and I am alive. That's more than I expected. He closed the notebook and lay back on his mattress, staring at the ceiling. Outside, the Alberta wind howled across the prairie. Inside, the stove kept them warm, and Friedrich began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he'd been fighting for the wrong side all along. Winter came hard to Alberta. By mid-December, the temperature dropped to minus 25 degrees Celsius, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. But inside Camp 133, the coal stoves burned all day and night. The prisoners settled into a routine that felt nothing like prison and everything like a strange new life. Every morning at 7 o'clock, a bell rang. The men woke and dressed and walked to the mess hall for breakfast. Porridge with brown sugar and raisins. Toast with jam. Real coffee, not the fake coffee made from acorns that they drank in Germany. Sometimes there was bacon or sausage. Friedrich kept a notebook where he wrote down everything he ate. By the end of the first week, he calculated he was gaining 1 kilogram every 10 days. His uniform pants were already getting tight around the waist. After breakfast, guards assigned work details. Some men cut firewood in the forest. Others did maintenance work around the camp, fixing fences and shoveling snow. Some worked on nearby farms, helping with winter chores. The prisoners who worked got paid 25 cents per day, deposited into camp accounts. With that money, they could buy things at the canteen, chocolate bars, cigarettes, soap, writing paper, even small luxuries like playing cards and books. Friedrich got assigned to a timber cutting crew in the Porcupine Hills, about 40 kilometers west of the camp. Every morning, a Canadian guard drove them in a truck up into the foothills where the trees grew thick. The work was hard, but not cruel. They cut logs for 8 hours, then rode back to camp. The guard's name was Corporal Davies, and he mostly sat in the truck reading newspapers while they worked. He trusted them not to run away. Where would they run to? They were in the middle of Canada in winter, with nowhere to go. One clear January morning, Friedrich looked up from his saw and saw the Rocky Mountains properly for the first time. The winter sun made them glow white and gold against the blue sky. They rose up massive and clean, bigger than the Alps back home, stretching north and south as far as he could see. Friedrich stood there with the saw in his hand, staring. He hadn't realized how much he missed mountains until he saw them again. A civilian man walked over to him. His name was Frank MacDonald, a local rancher who hired prisoners to help on his land. MacDonald spoke a little German from his grandfather. "You like mountains?" he asked. Friedrich nodded. "I was a ski instructor before the war," Friedrich said. "In Bavaria, mountains like these." MacDonald looked at the foothills around them. "Shame there's no ski hill here. My kids would love to learn." Friedrich studied the slopes. The grade was good, maybe 30 degrees. The exposure faced north, so snow would stay longer. There were trees for building materials. "You know," Friedrich said slowly, "we could build one. Back home, we built ski lifts with less than this." MacDonald laughed. "You're a prisoner. You can't just build a ski resort." But Friedrich kept thinking about it. What if they could? Hans got assigned to farm work. A Dutch immigrant named Willem Vandermeer owned 640 acres southeast of Lethbridge, and he needed help with winter work, feeding cattle, repairing equipment, mucking out barns. Hans rode out to the farm 3 days per week. Vandermeer was a quiet man in his 60s who treated Hans like a regular worker, not a prisoner. He showed Hans how to drive a tractor, a machine Hans had only seen once in his life. Vandermeer's farm had 5 tractors. Back in Germany, Hans's family farm had 2 horses and 12 hectares of land. This Canadian farm was 50 times bigger. At noon, Vandermeer's wife fed Hans lunch at their kitchen table. Thick sandwiches with real meat, hot soup, fresh milk, cookies for dessert. Hans ate in silence, overwhelmed by the simple abundance of it all. One afternoon, Vandermeer asked Hans about his family. Hans told him about the small farm in Holstein, about his mother and father and sister. Vandermeer nodded. "After the war, if you want to stay, I'll help you," he said. "Good workers are hard to find. You work hard." Hans didn't know what to say. Stay in Canada? Leave Germany forever? The idea seemed impossible and wonderful at the same time. In February, letters started arriving from home. The Red Cross transported mail, though it took 4 to 6 weeks to cross the ocean. Hans received a letter from his mother, written in December. Her handwriting shook on the page. She wrote about the ration cuts, 600 calories per day now, barely enough to survive. She wrote about Hamburg being bombed, entire neighborhoods gone. She wrote about Hans's father being conscripted at age 52 to dig trenches on the Eastern Front. "We are so hungry," she wrote. "I pray you are safe wherever you are." Hans read the letter 3 times. His mother was starving. His father, too old to fight, was digging frozen trenches in Russia. And Hans was sitting in a warm barracks, full from a dinner of roast chicken and mashed potatoes. He had gained 10 kilograms since arriving. His mother was losing weight. How was this possible? How could prisoners eat better than free people? Klaus still refused to cooperate. He ate the minimum food needed to survive, though Friedrich noticed he no longer threw any away. Klaus organized a group of about 30 prisoners who still believed in Nazi ideology. They called themselves the Loyalty Group, and held secret meetings where they reminded each other that Germany would win, that this treatment was temporary, that they must never forget who they really were. But Klaus was having nightmares. Friedrich heard him at night, talking in his sleep, saying, "No, no, it can't be true." One day, Klaus was caught trying to sabotage a work detail. He cut a rope that was being used to haul logs, hoping to slow down the day's work. The guards caught him immediately. Friedrich expected Klaus to be beaten, maybe locked in a cold cell with no food. Instead, the guards put Klaus in isolation. Friedrich visited him there the next day. The isolation cell was a small room with a bed, a table, a chair, and a window. There was a heater. They brought Klaus 3 meals per day. There were books on the shelf to read. Klaus sat on the bed looking confused and angry. "They won't even punish me properly," he said. "What kind of prison is this?" By March, camp life had developed its own rhythm and culture. A group of prisoners formed a theater company and built a stage in one of the empty warehouses. They performed Goethe's Faust, a famous German play. The actors made costumes from old curtains and painted scenery on boards. On opening night, 200 Canadian civilians from Lethbridge came to watch. They sat in chairs and watched German prisoners perform a German play in the German language, and at the end, everyone stood and clapped. Friedrich watched from backstage and thought, "This is madness. This is wonderful madness." Another group formed an orchestra with instruments donated by people in town. They practiced twice per week and gave concerts on Sunday afternoons. A Catholic priest named Father O'Donnell came to camp every week to hold Mass. 800 prisoners attended. A Lutheran pastor visited twice per month. The Canadians let them practice their religions freely, even though Germany banned most religious freedom. In May 1944, Friedrich finally asked Captain Morrison about building a ski hill. He drew up plans on paper, a 400-meter run down a foothill, a rope tow system made from camp materials, a small warming hut at the base. Morrison looked at the plans for a long time. "The Geneva Convention says POWs can't do military work," Morrison said. "But this isn't military. This is recreation." He thought about it for another minute. "Tell you what, if you can find 60 volunteers and build it without using any guard labor or official resources, you can do it, but it has to serve the community after the war. Fair?" Friedrich shook hands with Morrison. "Fair." Hans volunteered immediately. "I've never skied in my life," he said, "but I'll try anything." 59 other prisoners signed up, mostly men from Bavaria and Austria who missed the mountains. Klaus refused. "Building for our enemy," he muttered. "Disgraceful." But Friedrich noticed Klaus watching from a distance whenever they talked about the project. On June 6th, news reached the camp that Allied forces had landed in France. D-Day had happened. The invasion of Europe had begun. Some prisoners still hoped Germany would win. Others quietly hoped the war would just end. Friedrich wrote in his diary, "If we win, I return to a Reich built on lies. If we lose, at least I'll know the truth." He didn't know which outcome he wanted anymore. All he knew was that he was warm, he was fed, he had friends, and he was about to build a ski hill in the middle of a war. Nothing made sense anymore. And somehow that felt like progress. By December 1944, the ski hill was 70% complete. The prisoners had cut trees and hauled logs and built a rope tow system that actually worked. They dug foundations and raised walls for a small warming hut. Every day after regular work details, 60 men trudged up the foothill and kept building. The work gave them something to think about besides the war. But the war wouldn't let them forget. News came through the camp like cold wind. Germany had launched one final massive attack in Belgium, a place called the Bulge. For a few days, some prisoners felt hope. Maybe Germany could still win. But then more news came. The attack was failing. The German army was running out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of men. Everyone knew what this meant. The war was ending, and Germany was losing. The camp felt heavy with sadness and worry. Men walked around quietly, thinking about families back home, thinking about what would happen when they returned to a defeated country. Hans had received a letter from his sister saying she was eating potato peels boiled in water for dinner. Friedrich's wife wrote that their neighborhood had been bombed, and they were living in the basement of a damaged building. Klaus received no letters at all. His family in Essen had disappeared, and he didn't know if they were alive or dead. On December 20th, Captain Morrison made an announcement at dinner. "We're going to celebrate Christmas properly," he said. "You men are far from home. You deserve a real holiday." Some prisoners looked up with interest. Others just stared at their plates. Klaus sat in the corner with his arms crossed, not eating. Christmas Eve came on December 24th. The temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Celsius, so cold that ice crystals hung in the air and sparkled in the moonlight. But the sky was perfectly clear, and green northern lights danced across the stars like curtains waving in heaven. Friedrich stood outside the barracks before dinner, watching the lights and thinking about his sons. They would be 14 and 16 now. He hadn't seen them in 3 years. Did they remember him? Did they hate him for surrendering? The guards had decorated the mess hall with pine branches and paper chains that prisoners had made from colored paper. Someone had hung a big star made of tin over the serving counter. The room smelled like roasted meat and pine needles and wood smoke. When the prisoners walked in for dinner, they stopped and stared. The tables were set with real cloth napkins. There were candles burning in jars. And the smell was incredible. The cook served each man a plate piled high with food, roast turkey with crispy golden skin, mashed potatoes swimming in rich gravy, cranberry sauce dark red and sweet, warm bread, rolls with butter, and for dessert, plum pudding with cream. Friedrich looked at his plate and estimated at least 900 grams of food, more than a kilogram with the dessert. This was a feast. This was a meal for celebration, not for prisoners. But that wasn't all. As the men sat down to eat, guards walked around handing out small packages wrapped in brown paper. Each package contained a chocolate bar, a pack of cigarettes, and an envelope. Friedrich opened his envelope and found a handmade Christmas card. A child had drawn it with crayons. The drawing showed a stick figure family standing in front of a house with a crooked Christmas tree. At the bottom it said in careful printing, "Merry Christmas. We hope you can go home soon. Love, Tommy, age 7. Hans opened his card and stared at it for a long time. His card showed 2 stick figures holding hands, one with a German flag and one with a Canadian flag. The words said, "Friends, not enemies." At the bottom was signed Mary Sullivan, age 8. Hans's hand started shaking. He read it again, "Friends, not enemies." A child drew this. An enemy child drew this for him. A German soldier. A prisoner. Hans put his face in his hands and started crying. His whole body shook with sobs. Friedrich reached over and took the card from Heinz's hands. He looked at the 2 stick figures holding hands, the flag side by side in crayon, the careful child's handwriting. A guard named Sergeant Roberts walked over and saw Friedrich staring at the card. "My daughter's class made those," Roberts said quietly. "All the 3rd graders in Lethbridge. 4,200 cards. Took them 3 weeks. They wanted you men to have something for Christmas." Friedrich looked up at Roberts. "Your daughter made these? For us?" Roberts nodded. "Her name's Mary. She's the one who drew the 2 flags. She said everyone should be friends." Friedrich couldn't speak. He just held the card and felt something crack inside his chest. something he'd been holding onto for years, something hard and cold that was finally breaking apart. At 7 o'clock, Father O'Donnell held a Christmas Mass in the large recreation hall. 2,100 prisoners crowded in, sitting on benches and standing along the walls. The priest spoke in German, his voice gentle and strong at the same time. He talked about peace and forgiveness and hope. Then a Canadian Protestant chaplain stood up and read from the Bible in English. Friedrich understood enough to catch the words, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." Peace, goodwill toward men. Friedrich looked around at the Canadian Guard standing respectfully at attention along the walls. These men could have been cruel. They could have starved the prisoners, beaten them, worked them to death. Instead, they fed them turkey. Their children drew them Christmas cards. What kind of enemy does that? The orchestra played Stille Nacht, Silent Night, and 2,000 German voices sang together in the darkness. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wacht. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Men cried openly. Friedrich cried. Even some of the guards were wiping their eyes. After the service, Friedrich walked outside into the freezing night. The northern lights were still dancing, green and white, and flowing like rivers in the sky. Hans and Klaus came out and stood beside him. Nobody spoke for a long time. Finally, Hans said quietly, "My sister wrote that she's eating potato peels." "We just had turkey and plum pudding." Friedrich held up the Christmas card in his hand. The guard's daughter drew this. 8 years old. In Germany, we were told to hate their children, to see them as the enemy, but she drew two people holding hands. Klaus stood very still, staring at the northern lights. Then he spoke, and his voice sounded broken and old. "I was at Kristallnacht, November 1938. I was 22 years old. They told us it was patriotic. They told us Jews were vermin, that we were cleaning Germany. I broke windows of a synagogue in Essen. I watched my friends beat an old man who was just trying to protect his store. They told us it was right. They told us we were heroes." Klaus's voice cracked. "These people fed us turkey. A child drew me a picture of two friends. What did we do? What did I do?" Friedrich didn't have an answer. He just stood there in the freezing cold under the northern lights, holding a Christmas card made by an 8-year-old enemy child who wanted prisoners to know they could be friends. Everything he'd believed for 12 years was collapsing. Everything he'd been taught, everything he'd fought for, every reason he'd told himself the war was necessary, all of it was a lie. These enemies showed more humanity in one meal than his government had shown in a decade of power. Klaus reached into his uniform collar and pulled out the small Hitler Youth pin he'd worn since 1936. He looked at it for a moment, then walked over to a snowbank and pushed it deep into the snow. He stood there with his hand in the snow, burying the last piece of his belief. When he pulled his hand out, it was red from the cold. He walked back to Friedrich and Hans and said nothing. Hans asked the question they were all thinking. "What do we do when we go back?" Friedrich folded the Christmas card carefully and put it in his pocket next to the unsent letter to his wife. "We tell the truth," he said, "no matter what it costs us. We tell the truth." The three men stood together under the northern lights on Christmas Eve 1944, and the war that had shaped their lives for so long felt very far away. Something new was growing in its place, something small and fragile and honest. They had been enemies. They had been soldiers for evil. But maybe, just maybe, they could become something different. Maybe they could become the kind of men who deserved Christmas cards from children. Maybe they could become the kind of men who built things instead of destroying them. It was a start. After Christmas, something changed in Camp 133. The prisoners stopped pretending everything was fine. They stopped avoiding the hard questions. Some men embraced the truth they'd discovered. Others fought against it with everything they had. The camp divided into groups, and the division created tension that sometimes exploded into violence. About 2,900 prisoners became what Friedrich called the hardliners. They still believed Germany would win. They still believed the Nazi cause was right. They said the good treatment was a trick, a way to make prisoners weak and soft. These men isolated themselves in certain barracks and refused to participate in any activities. When they saw other prisoners laughing with guards or working happily on the ski hill, they called them traitors. The largest group, about 7,250 men, became what Friedrich called the pragmatists. They recognized they'd been lied to, but they weren't ready to completely reject everything they'd believed. They adapted to camp life. They worked their jobs. They waited for the war to end. They didn't talk about politics or ideology. They just survived day by day, trying not to think too hard about what it all meant. Then there were the transformers, about 2,050 prisoners who actively rejected Nazi ideology. These men attended the voluntary education programs. They read books about democracy. They learned English. They talked openly about how propaganda had poisoned their thinking. Friedrich, Hans, and Klaus were part of this group. In late January, hardliners vandalized the ski hill. They cut the rope tow lines and knocked over support posts that had taken weeks to build. Friedrich found the damage early one morning and stood staring at the broken ropes lying in the snow. He felt anger burn in his chest. 60 men had worked for months to build this, and other Germans, their own countrymen, had destroyed it out of spite. Captain Morrison separated the groups into different barracks after that. Hardliners went to the east side of camp. Transformers and pragmatists stayed on the west side. Guards patrolled between the areas to prevent fights. But the separation didn't stop the tension. Men who used to be friends now glared at each other across the camp yard. Brothers argued until they stopped speaking. The war was tearing them apart even here, thousands of miles from the battlefield. Friedrich threw himself into finishing the ski hill. He organized repair crews to fix the damage and reinforced everything so it couldn't be easily broken again. By mid-February, the hill was complete. The run stretched 450 meters down a smooth slope. The rope tow worked perfectly, pulling skiers back up the hill. The warming hut had a wood stove inside and benches where people could rest. Friedrich suggested they name it Freiheit-Hügel, Freedom Hill. The first thing we built without orders, without fear, he explained to Morrison. Morrison approved the name. 300 prisoners learned to ski that winter. Some had skied before, in Bavaria or Austria. Others, like Hans, had never seen skis in their lives. Hans fell down constantly at first, tumbling into snowbanks and sliding uncontrollably down the hill. But he kept trying. By March, he could make it down the hill without falling. He wasn't graceful, but he was skiing. "I'm doing something I never thought I'd do," he told Friedrich. "Everything about this place teaches me I was wrong about the world." 500 other prisoners came to watch, sitting on logs around the warming hut and cheering when someone made a good run. The Lethbridge newspaper sent a reporter who wrote an article titled "German POWs Build Community Ski Hill." Local residents read the story and started donating old skis and boots. A family brought 3 pairs of skis their children had outgrown. A widow brought her dead husband's boots. The pile of donated equipment grew until there was enough for everyone. In March, Captain Morrison became the first Canadian civilian allowed on the hill. Friedrich taught him the basics: how to position his feet, how to shift his weight, how to stop. Morrison fell 5 times but kept laughing and getting back up. At the bottom of the hill, breathing hard and covered in snow, Morrison shook Friedrich's hand. "You've built something that will outlast this war," Morrison said. "That's worth remembering." Hans's letters home became more honest. In March, he wrote to his mother, "I work on a farm now. The owner treats me like his son. He's teaching me to operate machines we don't have in Germany. He says after the war I should consider staying. Canada has homestead land, 160 acres free if you clear and farm it. I'm thinking about it." He mailed the letter and waited nervously for her response. 6 weeks later, her reply came. "We have nothing left," she wrote. "Father is missing in Russia. Our house is damaged, and we live in 2 rooms with another family. The food rations keep getting smaller. If you can make a life there, do it. Don't come back to this." Hans read the letter sitting on his bunk and cried quietly. His mother was telling him to abandon Germany. His mother, who had lived in the same village her whole life, was telling him to stay in a foreign country and never come home. That's how bad things were. Hans borrowed English books from the camp library. He studied every night, learning words and grammar and how to speak like a Canadian. He couldn't apply for citizenship yet. He was still a prisoner, but he prepared anyway. Willem Vandermeer had promised to help sponsor him when the time came. Klaus struggled differently. After Christmas, he started attending Protestant church services led by the Canadian chaplain. He volunteered for farm work 7 days per week, even though they only required 5. A Canadian farmer named Henry Park noticed Klaus never collected his wages from the camp office. "Why won't you take your pay?" Park asked him one afternoon while they were mending a fence. Klaus hammered a post into the frozen ground and didn't look up. "I don't deserve payment. I fought for evil. I should work for free." Park leaned on his shovel. "Son, the war isn't your fault. You were 15 when Hitler took power. You were just a kid. Take the money. Send it home. Help somebody." Klaus stopped hammering. Nobody had said that to him before. Nobody had told him he wasn't completely responsible for everything. He took his back pay, 7 months of wages, $52.50, and sent it all to a German refugee organization that helped people displaced by the bombing. Every month after that, he sent his entire 25 cents per day. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a small piece of repayment for the damage he'd helped cause. Klaus joined the adult education program and read Winston Churchill's speeches translated into German. He studied the words of the man he'd been taught to hate and found wisdom there. He wrote a letter he never sent, addressed to the synagogue in Essen. "I was there in 1938. I broke your windows. I cannot undo what I did, but I will spend my life ensuring no one forgets why it was wrong." The barracks debates grew heated. One night, a hardliner shouted at Friedrich across the common room, "You've become their puppet. You're building for our enemies. You've forgotten who you are." Friedrich stood up slowly. "No," he said. "I've remembered who I am. I'm human. You should try it." The hardliner lunged at Friedrich, fists swinging. Other men jumped in. The fight spread until guards rushed in and separated everyone. The guards didn't hit anyone. They just formed a wall between the two groups and firmly escorted the hardliners back to their barracks. In March 1945, Captain Morrison announced a voluntary re-education program. He set up a projector in the recreation hall and showed documentary films from the concentration camps that Allied soldiers had just liberated. Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, places where bodies were stacked like firewood, places where living people looked like skeletons. 1,200 prisoners came to watch. Some vomited in the aisles. Some left crying. Some sat frozen in their seats, unable to process what they were seeing. The footage lasted 40 minutes. Klaus sat through every second. When the lights came on, he couldn't move. He just stared at the blank screen. Hans turned to Friedrich in the darkness. Did we know? Did we know this was happening? Friedrich's voice was barely a whisper. We chose not to know. There's no excuse for that. Some prisoners attempted suicide that night. The camp doctor found them and stopped them and brought counselors to talk with them. The Canadian chaplain said to one sobbing prisoner, "You can't change the past, but you can choose who you become from this moment forward." In April, the ski hill opened to civilians. Captain Morrison invited people from Lethbridge to come use the hill. 150 locals showed up on a Saturday morning, families with children, elderly couples, teenagers wanting to try skiing. 60 prisoners demonstrated technique and offered lessons. Children asked the prisoners to teach them, and the prisoners agreed, speaking in broken English and hand gestures and smiles. Friedrich taught a 9-year-old Chinese-Canadian boy named Tommy Chen how to bend his knees and keep his weight forward. Tommy's mother watched nervously from the warming hut. Friedrich waved to her. "He's safe," Friedrich called out. "I have 2 sons his age back home." It was the first time he'd mentioned his family to anyone outside of letters. That moment changed something in Friedrich. He realized his sons were growing up in a dying Reich, being taught the same lies he'd once believed. He couldn't go back and teach them that ideology. He wouldn't. That afternoon, he told Captain Morrison, "I want to apply to stay in Canada after the war. I want to bring my family here. I can't raise my sons in what Germany has become." Morrison nodded slowly. "We'll see what we can do. First, the war has to end. Then we'll talk about the future." The war was ending. Everyone knew it. And the prisoners had to decide who they would be when it was over. Men who learned nothing, or men who learned everything. The news came on May 8th, 1945, just after noon. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. A guard walked through the camp yard ringing a bell and shouting, "It's done! The war is done!" Prisoners came running out of barracks and work buildings, gathering in confused clusters. Some men fell to their knees and cried. Some stood silent and stunned. The hardliners shouted that it was lies, impossible propaganda. Friedrich just sat down on the cold ground and stared at the mountains. 3 years. 3 years since Monte Cassino. 3 years of being a prisoner. And now it was over. And Germany had lost. Hans immediately wrote a letter home. His hands shook as he wrote the words, "It's over. I'm alive. Are you?" He gave the letter to the mail clerk that afternoon, but he knew it would take 6 weeks to reach Germany. 6 weeks of not knowing if his mother was alive or dead, if his village still existed, if there was anything left to return to. The prisoners didn't go home right away. Europe was chaos. Cities were destroyed. Roads were gone. Train lines were bombed. Millions of refugees were moving across the continent looking for somewhere to go. The Canadian government decided to keep the POWs through the summer and release them gradually as transportation became available. So the men stayed in Camp 133, living in a strange limbo between war and peace, between prisoner and free man. Work programs continued. The farm still needed help with spring planting and summer harvest. The ski hill needed maintenance for the next winter. Friedrich and his crew repaired the warming hut roof and replaced worn sections of the rope tow. The hill had become part of Lethbridge now. Children from town came 3 times per week to practice skiing, even though there was no snow. They hiked up and ran down, pretending, getting ready for winter. In June, Friedrich submitted his immigration application. He filled out forms asking about his education, his work history, his skills. He wrote an essay explaining why he wanted to stay in Canada. "I want to raise my sons in a country that values humanity over ideology," he wrote. I want them to grow up where kindness is normal, not weakness. I want them to learn that enemies can become friends if given the chance. Captain Morrison wrote a letter of recommendation. Friedrich Weber has demonstrated exceptional character, work ethic, and commitment to democratic values. He built a ski hill that serves our community. I recommend his application be approved. The paperwork went to Ottawa. The response came back weeks later. Application filed. Decision pending review of all POW cases. Friedrich would have to wait. He would have to go back to Germany first, then reapply from there. But at least there was hope. Hans received his mother's letter in July. His father was dead, killed in Berlin during the final battle. His sister had married an American soldier and was moving to the United States. The family farm was destroyed. His mother was living in 2 rooms with neighbors, eating whatever she could find. "Come home if you can," she wrote. "But if Canada is better, stay there. Your father would want you to live, not suffer with us." Hans showed the letter to Willem Vandermeer. The old Dutch farmer read it slowly and nodded. "Bring her here," Vandermeer said. "After you get your papers, bring her here. I've got a small house on the back 40 she can live in. Your mother shouldn't starve in Germany while you eat well in Canada." Hans couldn't speak. He just shook the farmer's hand and held on tight. Klaus decided to return to Germany first. "I need to see what we did," he told Friedrich. "I need to help rebuild what I helped destroy. Then maybe I'll come back here." He filed an immigration application too, but marked it future consideration. He wanted to go home, do his part in the reconstruction, witness Germany's recovery. Then, maybe in a few years, he'd return to Canada. Repatriation began in October 1945. The hardliners left first. They were considered security risks, and the Canadians wanted them gone. Through the winter and spring, groups of prisoners boarded trains heading east to Halifax, then ships crossing back to Europe. Friedrich's group was scheduled for April 1946. On their last day, the mayor of Lethbridge came to the camp for a farewell ceremony. He thanked the prisoners for building the ski hill and signed an agreement making it permanent community property. "You leave us something good," the mayor said. "We'll remember that." The prisoners who built the hill received certificates naming them honorary citizens of Lethbridge. The certificates weren't legal documents, but they meant something. They meant the community saw them as more than just prisoners. Captain Morrison shook Friedrich's hand. "Come back when you can. You have friends here." Friedrich nodded, unable to speak. This enemy officer had become more of a friend than most of the men Friedrich had fought alongside. The train to Halifax left on an April morning. Friedrich, Hans, and Klaus sat together in a passenger car, watching Canada roll past the windows one last time. They looked different than when they'd arrived. Friedrich had gained 27 pounds. Hans had gained 47 pounds. Their uniforms were clean and in good repair. Klaus could read and write in English now. They'd learned carpentry, farming, and surveying. They'd learned that enemies could show mercy. They'd learned that everything they'd been taught was wrong. The ship crossing took 8 days. Friedrich stood at the rail and watched the Atlantic waves, thinking about the crossing 3 years earlier. Then he'd expected to die. Now he was alive, healthy, educated, and headed home to a country that no longer existed in the way he remembered it. The ship docked at Hamburg in early May 1946. Friedrich walked down the gangway and stopped at the bottom, staring. The city was gone. 60% of Hamburg was destroyed, just rubble and broken walls and twisted metal. 24 square miles of devastation. Refugees filled the streets, thousands of them, carrying everything they owned in bags and carts. Children begged for cigarettes to trade for food. Old women sold wedding rings for bread. A former Wehrmacht soldier, now working as a policeman for the British occupation, handed Friedrich his discharge papers. "Welcome home, comrade," the policeman said with bitter sarcasm. "This is what we fought for." Friedrich took a train south to Bavaria. The train moved slowly through countryside dotted with destroyed villages and burned fields. When he finally reached his town, he found his house still standing but damaged. Part of the roof was gone, windows were broken, but his wife and sons were alive. His wife Helena ran to him crying, holding him tight, but his sons stood back, suspicious. They were 14 and 16 now, tall and thin and angry. The older boy, Karl, crossed his arms. "You abandoned us," Karl said. "You surrendered like a coward while we suffered here." Friedrich felt his heart break. His sons had been taught to hate him. The Hitler Youth, the Nazi propaganda, all of it had poisoned their minds during the years he was gone. Helena whispered, "They don't understand. The Reich told them you were a traitor." Friedrich looked at his sons and thought about Tommy Chen, the Chinese-Canadian boy he'd taught to ski. He thought about Mary Sullivan's Christmas card with the two stick figures holding hands. He thought about everything he'd learned in Canada. "Then I'll teach them the truth," Friedrich said quietly. "However long it takes." The war was over. But for Friedrich, Hans, and Klaus, the real work was just beginning. Friedrich spent 6 years in Germany rebuilding what the war had destroyed. He worked on construction crews, using the surveying skills he had learned in Canada to help plan new roads and buildings across Bavaria. The country was a wasteland. Cities were piles of rubble. Factories were burned shells. Millions of people had nowhere to live and nothing to eat. But slowly, brick by brick, Germany began to rebuild. The hardest work was rebuilding his sons. Karl and Stefan had spent their teenage years in the Hitler Youth, learning to worship the Führer and hate everyone else. They believed their father was a traitor for surrendering. Friedrich sat with them night after night, showing them photographs from Canada, reading them letters, explaining what he'd learned. He told them about the Christmas cards from children. He told them about the farmers who paid him extra money even though he was a prisoner. He told them about the concentration camp footage he'd watched, and he didn't let them look away from the truth. It took 2 years before Karl started to understand. It took 3 years before Stefan stopped being angry. By 1948, both boys were asking questions instead of arguing. They wanted to know more about Canada. They wanted to see the ski hill their father had built. Friedrich received a letter from Captain Morrison that year. "The ski hill is more popular than ever," Morrison wrote. 500 children learned to ski this winter. Come back and see it." Friedrich saved every penny he earned. By 1950, he had enough money to apply for immigration again. This time, the application was approved. In 1952, Friedrich Weber, his wife Helena, and his 2 sons boarded a ship to Canada. They arrived in Halifax 7 years after Friedrich had left as a released prisoner. This time, he arrived as an immigrant, a free man bringing his family to a new country. They settled in Lethbridge. Friedrich got a job as a ski instructor at the expanded resort. The original rope tow had been replaced with a modern ski lift. 2 new runs had been added, but the warming hut he'd built still stood, solid and strong, with the wood stove still burning on cold days. Friedrich worked at that ski hill for 23 years, teaching thousands of children to ski. In 1975, the town renamed one of the runs Weber's Run in his honor. Friedrich objected. He said it was too much, but the town council insisted. Hans never went back to Germany. He stayed on Willem Vandermeer's farm, working from spring 1946 through 1963. He learned everything about modern farming, how to maintain tractors, how to rotate crops, how to manage large-scale operations. In 1949, he saved enough money to bring his mother to Canada. She lived with him in a small house on the farm until she died peacefully in 1967, surrounded by grandchildren she never expected to meet. In 1952, Hans married a German-Canadian woman named Anna, whose family had immigrated before the war. They had 4 children together. In 1964, Hans bought his own farm, 640 acres of Alberta prairie southeast of Lethbridge. He named it Hoffnung Farm, which means hope farm in German. He raised cattle and wheat and built a life that was everything his family's tiny farm in Germany could never be. In 1970, Hans was elected to the Lethbridge Town Council. He served 4 years, helping make decisions about schools and roads and community programs. People who knew him said he was fair and practical and always thought about what was best for children. When Hans died in 1998 at age 76, his obituary called him a German POW, who became an Alberta rancher and community leader. At his funeral, over 300 people came to say goodbye. Klaus returned to Essen in 1946 and stayed for 6 years. He worked rubble clearance, hauling broken bricks and twisted metal from destroyed buildings. He helped rebuild the factory district where he'd worked before the war. But this time, he made sure the new factories had proper safety rules and 8-hour workdays and unions to protect workers. He joined a Lutheran church and attended services every Sunday, trying to rebuild his soul the way he rebuilt buildings. In 1952, Klaus applied to immigrate to Canada. Captain Morrison vouched for him, writing a letter to the immigration office explaining Klaus's transformation. Klaus settled in Calgary and worked construction. He became a foreman in 1960, managing crews that built schools and hospitals. He married a widow with 2 children and raised them as his own. Klaus spent 25 years teaching Sunday school at his church. Every class, he told the children the same thing. I was taught to hate people I'd never met. Then I was fed by those people and shown kindness by them. Propaganda cannot survive when you actually meet people. Don't let anyone teach you to hate from a distance. In 1985, Klaus volunteered for a Holocaust education program, visiting schools and sharing his story with students. He wanted young people to understand how ordinary men could do terrible things when they stopped seeing others as human. Friedrich, Hans, and Klaus remained friends for the rest of their lives. Their families gathered once per month for 35 years, big dinners where children and grandchildren played together, while the 3 old men sat on porches and remembered. They never talked much about the war itself. Mostly they talked about the ski hill, about the Christmas cards, about the farmers who treated them with kindness. They talked about the moment they realized everything they'd believed was wrong, and how terrifying and wonderful that moment was. Friedrich's sons both graduated from the University of Alberta. Karl became an engineer, and Stefan became a teacher. Both of them taught their own children. Your grandfather was wrong about the world, but he learned to be right. That means anyone can change if they're willing to face the truth. The ski hill kept growing. By 1962, it had modern lifts and 3 runs. In 1978, they expanded the warming hut and renamed it POW Memorial Lodge. A bronze plaque was installed in 1980. It read, "Built 1944-1945 by German prisoners of war," maintained by the community they served. A reminder that even in war, humanity builds bridges. The ski hill still operates today in 2024, 80 years after Friedrich first imagined it. It has trained over 10,000 skiers. Every winter, children from Lethbridge learn to ski on the same slopes that German prisoners built during wartime. In 2015, 3 surviving POW builders attended the 70th anniversary celebration. They were 92, 93 and 94 years old. One of them said to the crowd, "We came as enemies and built something for children we'd never meet." Turns out that's what peace looks like. Friedrich died in 1997 at age 88. A few months before he died, he wrote one final entry in his diary. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "I spent 5 years fighting for a lie, and 3 years imprisoned by the truth. The truth was kinder. We built a ski hill because we were homesick and needed something to believe in. We built it with our hands and materials given by people we'd been taught to destroy. 45 years later, I watch children ski down that hill. None of them know who built it. That's as it should be. We didn't build it for recognition. We built it because we finally understood. Real strength isn't domination, it's creation. The ski hill will outlast me. That's legacy enough." On a cold January morning in 2024, children strap on skis and ride the lift up the expanded resort. 12 runs now cover the hillside. But the original warming hut still stands, preserved as a museum. Inside are photographs of Friedrich, Hans, Klaus, and 60 other prisoners who built something that lasted. A caption on the wall reads, "When enemies become builders, everyone wins." Outside, the temperature is minus 15 degrees Celsius. The sky is clear and blue, exactly like it was on Christmas Eve, 1944. A grandfather teaches his granddaughter to ski on the same hill that German prisoners built 80 years ago when they learned that kindness is more powerful than propaganda, and that what we build together lasts longer than what we destroy alone.